The knife fell to the floor with a metallic sound that echoed through the silent kitchen. My fingers were trembling so much I could barely hold it. There, on the white marble countertop that I had chosen so carefully 15 years ago, sat Grandma Helena's apple pie, that same recipe I kept like a treasure, that made my heart warm with longing every time the smell of cinnamon filled the house. But at that moment, looking at that perfectly golden pie, with the edges crispy exactly as Grandma used to teach, I felt only an icy emptiness spreading through my chest. This can't be true, I whispered to nothing, to the walls that had witnessed 22 years of my marriage, to the refrigerator covered with family photos that now seemed like carefully staged lies. I picked up the piece of paper that was next to the pie. The handwriting was neat, feminine, definitely not mine. The words danced before my eyes, blurred with tears I refused to let fall. Not yet. Not before fully understanding what was happening. For Ricardo, with all my love, I know this is your favorite pie. I used the special recipe you gave me. I can't wait for tonight. Yours forever, M. Just one letter. One letter that destroyed everything. My husband, Ricardo, was at an important meeting that Friday afternoon. He called me in the morning, as he always did, with that sweet voice I knew so well. Honey, I'll be late today. You know how it is, end of the month, closing contracts. Don't wait up for dinner. I said it was okay, that I understood that it had always been like this. 22 years of marriage teach you to accept certain things, not to question every delay, every extra meeting. But something was different today. Maybe it was the way he avoided eye contact when he picked up his briefcase in the morning. Maybe it was the new cologne he started wearing 3 months ago. Or maybe it was just intuition, that sixth sense we women have that he always mocked, saying it was paranoia. I should have been at the hair salon. It was my sacred Friday afternoon. Those 3 hours when I finally took care of myself, where Sonia washed my hair and I could forget about bills, the house, responsibilities. But Sonia called early in the morning. Her daughter had gotten sick, and she needed to cancel. So I came home early. Our home. The house we built together brick by brick, where we raised our 2 children, where I dedicated every minute of my life to creating a perfect home. I entered through the garage and immediately noticed his car parked on the street. Ricardo never parked on the street. He said paying high property taxes gave him the right to the garage. My heart raced. Maybe he had come back early, wanting to surprise me? It had been a while since he had done something like that. I climbed the porch steps with a smile on my lips, thinking about how nice it would be to have an afternoon just for us, no commitments, no children. Lucas was at college in another state and Marina living with her boyfriend. The house was just ours now. But when I put the key in the lock, I heard voices. Laughter. His voice and another voice. Female. Young. I pushed the door open slowly, my heart pounding against my ribs. The sounds were coming from the kitchen. My kitchen. I stood paralyzed in the hallway, hidden behind the wall that separated the dining room from the kitchen. You're amazing, I heard Ricardo say with a tenderness he hadn't used with me in years. How did you figure out the recipe? I have my secrets. A young voice replied, followed by a little laugh that made my stomach turn. But I confess it wasn't easy. You said it was the pie your mother-in-law made, that your wife never wanted to teach the recipe to anyone because it was a family secret. My blood ran cold. Grandma Helena's recipe. The recipe she gave me on her deathbed, making me swear I would only teach it to someone very special, someone in the family. The recipe I kept in an old notebook, hidden at the back of my nightstand drawer. And how did you get it? He asked, and I could imagine that smile of his, the one I thought was only mine. Well, let's just say having access to the house has its advantages. Access to the house. This woman, this M, had access to my house. She had entered my bedroom, searched through my things, stolen my grandmother's recipe. And Ricardo had brought her here. To our house. To our kitchen. I heard the sound of a kiss. Long. And when I heard Ricardo moan softly, something inside me broke. It wasn't pain. It wasn't sadness. It was anger. A cold, calculating anger that I didn't know existed inside me. I waited. I took a deep breath. And then, With firm steps, I entered the kitchen. They jumped apart. Ricardo turned pale, his mouth open, unable to speak. And she was young. Very young. She couldn't be more than 25. Pretty, with that kind of easy beauty of youth, with skin not yet marked by time, by childbirth, by sleepless nights taking care of sick children. She had blonde hair tied in a loose ponytail, wore an apron, my apron, the one with cherry print that Marina gave me on Mother's Day. And on the counter, the pie. That damned apple pie from Grandma Helena. Laura, I can explain. Ricardo finally found his voice. But I didn't want explanations. Not at that moment. I looked at the pie, at the letter, at that girl wearing my apron in my kitchen, and something inside me changed forever. I picked up the knife that had fallen and, with a calm that surprised even me, cut a generous piece of the pie. 22 years, I said, my voice strangely steady. 22 years I made this pie for you every Sunday. 22 years I kept this recipe like a treasure. I brought the piece of pie to my mouth. I chewed slowly. It was perfect. Exactly like Grandma's. Exactly like mine. It's delicious, I said, looking directly at him. Congratulations, Em. You learned well. And then, with the dignity that 22 years of marriage had taught me to maintain, even when the world is falling apart, I turned and went up the stairs to my room. I didn't know yet what I was going to do. But as I climbed each step, one certainty grew inside me. This betrayal, revealed by my grandmother's pie, would not go unanswered. I sat on the edge of the bed we'd shared for over 2 decades and let reality hit me like a wave. The room was exactly as I had left it that morning. Bed made with the linen sheets I bought on sale, pillows arranged, everything in its place. But now it seemed like a set, a well-mounted lie. The air itself felt different, thick with the ghost of what I had just witnessed downstairs. I could still smell the faint, traitorous scent of cinnamon and baked apples clinging to my clothes, a perfume of betrayal. My eyes scanned the room, and every object seemed to scream its complicity. The photo on his nightstand from our vacation in Italy, where he looked at me with what I thought was everlasting adoration. The book I'd been reading, splayed open on my nightstand, its fictional drama now paling in comparison to my own. I heard quick footsteps on the stairs, his voice calling me, "Laura? Laura, please," but I didn't respond. The sound was an intrusion, a foreign noise in the ruins of my life. My body was frozen, but my mind was a whirlwind. I grabbed my phone from the duvet, my hands trembling so violently I almost dropped it. I fumbled for the slip of paper in my pocket, the one with the neat, feminine handwriting. For Ricardo, with all my love. Yours forever, M. I smoothed it out on the bedside table, the paper feeling filthy against my skin. The flash from my phone illuminated the words, turning them from a private secret into a piece of cold, hard evidence. I needed evidence. My mother's voice, sharp and pragmatic even from the grave, echoed in my head. A smart woman always prepares for the worst, Laura. Hope for the best, but for God's sake, prepare for the worst. She was right. She always was. I took another picture, then a close-up of the M. I saved them to a cloud folder I named Legal, my heart hammering a sickening rhythm against my ribs. This was the new language of my marriage. Not love letters, but documentation. The knocking started, a soft, persistent rap that quickly grew more frantic. Laura, please open the door. Let me explain. It's not what you're thinking. A sound escaped my lips, something between a sob and a strangled laugh. It's never what we're thinking, is it? Except when it's exactly what we're thinking, only worse, more sordid and humiliating than our darkest suspicions could ever conjure. The gall of him, to stand out there and use that tired, pathetic line. The calm I had mustered in the kitchen was cracking, and in its place, a raw, jagged fury began to pulse. I stood up, my legs feeling unsteady, and walked to the door. I didn't open it slowly. I yanked it open, the knob rattling, making him jump back. He was there, already wearing that repentant boy face, the one he perfected over years of minor transgressions, forgotten birthdays, missed recitals, working through anniversaries. His eyes were wide, pleading, his hair slightly disheveled as if he'd been running his hands through it. But this was different. This wasn't forgetfulness. This was a calculated, sustained choice. A 6-month choice, at least. The new cologne I'd noticed, the late nights I'd defended to my friends, the emotional distance I'd blamed on stress, it all crystallized into a single, painful shard of truth. "Explain then," I said, my voice low and dangerously steady as I crossed my arms over my chest, a feeble barrier against the pain. My gaze was locked on his, refusing to let him look away. "Explain how that girl knows my grandmother's recipe. The one I kept in a locked drawer. The one I swore on Grandma Helena's soul I would protect. Explain why she was in my kitchen, wearing my apron, the one with the goddamn cherries Marina painted herself, making pie for you." He flinched at the specifics, at the tangible details that made his abstract sin so concrete. She must have seen it when she was here," he stammered, his eyes darting to a spot over my shoulder, unable to hold my stare. "Seen it?" I repeated, the words dripping with a sarcasm so cold it surprised even me. "She just happened to see a handwritten recipe tucked away in my private nightstand while she was, what, Ricardo? Watering the plants? Using the bathroom? Or were you giving her a tour of our bedroom, showing her where we sleep?" The image, vivid and horrifying, flashed behind my eyes, and I felt a fresh wave of nausea. My sanctuary was violated. Every corner of this house, which I had built into a home with my own 2 hands, now felt contaminated. "It wasn't like that," he insisted, a desperate whine creeping into his voice. "She came by a couple of times to pick up documents I'd forgotten. She was just in the office." "The office?" I shot back, my voice rising. "The office where we keep the family computer? The filing cabinets with the children's birth certificates? That office? Or were you both just using it as a convenient lie, a little playhouse while I was out getting my hair done, believing in the life you were so carefully dismantling behind my back?" He had no answer for that. He just stood there, shrinking before me, the powerful businessman reduced to a caught schoolboy. And in that silence, the full weight of the betrayal settled deep into my bones. It wasn't just the affair. It was the invasion. It was the theft of something sacred, the casual way he had allowed this stranger to rifle through the artifacts of our life together, to steal a piece of my grandmother's legacy just to please him. He had handed her the keys to my world, and she had helped herself to the treasures inside. And as I looked at him, pale and speechless in the hallway, I knew the woman who had walked up the stairs minutes ago was gone. In her place was someone new, someone harder, someone who was just beginning to fight. He tried to touch me, but I backed away. "Don't touch me," I warned, and something in my tone made him stop. It was a new tone, forged in the fire of betrayal I'd just witnessed, and it carried a finality that even he couldn't ignore. His hand froze in the air between us, a bridge he was no longer permitted to cross. Ricardo ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I knew well. It's what he did when he was nervous, when a big deal was falling through or he'd forgotten an important date. Seeing it now, in this context, felt like a desecration of a familiar memory. Every shared tic, every known habit, was now being retrofitted with lies. Was my secretary. Mariana, he finally said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. She worked with me for 6 months. Mariana. Of course. The name landed not as a shock, but as a final, sickening piece of a puzzle I hadn't even known I was solving. It was a real name for the ghost who had been haunting my marriage, a name to attach to the youthful laughter that had echoed in my kitchen. And she decided, what? To learn how to make apple pie, because she's very dedicated to her work. My voice was loaded with a sarcasm, so sharp it could have drawn blood. I wanted it to hurt. I wanted him to feel the absurdity, the profound disrespect of it all. He couldn't meet my eyes, his gaze fixed on a scuff mark on the hallway floor as if it held the secrets of the universe. It happened. I didn't plan it. You were always so busy with the house, with the kids, even after they left. We grew apart. There it was. The classic excuse, delivered with the scripted weariness of a bad actor.
It was my fault.
My fault for ensuring our children had a stable home. My fault for making sure this house was a sanctuary, not just a pit stop. My fault for dedicating my life to the family he claimed to cherish, while he built his career on the foundation of my unpaid labor. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of it stole my breath for a second. He had taken the architecture of my love and tried to use it as the blueprint for my negligence. And the recipe? I insisted, my voice dropping to a deadly calm. The affair was a wound, a deep and bleeding one, but the recipe, that was a sacrilege. How did she get it? Ricardo hesitated, and in that hesitation, I saw the extent of the betrayal bloom into something even uglier. It wasn't just a fleeting moment of passion. It was a sustained campaign of carelessness and entitlement with my most private things. She came here a few times, he mumbled, still addressing the floor. When you weren't here. To the office. She needed some documents I'd forgotten. The words were like a physical blow. Here? In our house. The walls seemed to press in, the very air turning toxic. In our bed. The question was a whisper, ripped from a place of pure horror. He shook his head quickly, a frantic, jerky motion.
No.
In the office only. Just the office. A luz du entardecer filtrata pela janela pintava sombras don cantes nas paredes, en cuanto ele relia as palavras pela tercera vez. O silencio na sala era tão profundo que ele podia ouvir o sussurro das páginas sendo viradas. Cada parágrafo era degrau, uma pecada quebra-cabeça que lentamente comunicava a se encaixar sua mente, conduzindo-o, sem pressa, para a conclusão inevitável que o aguardava nas linhas finas. The violation of my sanctuary, the room where we'd whispered our dreams and weathered nightmares, left every corner of the house I had built feeling contaminated, every memory now suspect. I just stood there, the silence stretching between us, the truth I had refused to see now laid bare in the wreckage of the room. He had no answer. He just stood there, shrinking in the hallway we'd painted together the summer Lucas was born. His silence was a void, and into it poured a chilling clarity. The woman who had walked up the stairs was gone. In her place stood someone new, forged in the fire of this betrayal, and she was just beginning to fight. Get out, I said, the words quiet but absolute. He blinked, confused. Laura, we need to. Get out of this house. Now. I didn't shout. The calm was back, but it was the calm of a glacier, immense and unstoppable. You don't get to stand in the home I made and explain how you helped destroy it. Where am I supposed to go? He asked, and the sheer childishness of the question almost made me laugh. Almost. That, I said, turning my back on him and walking toward the kitchen, is no longer my problem. I didn't wait to hear the door close. I stood at the kitchen sink, my hands gripping the cool porcelain, and listened. I listened to the heavy tread of his footsteps, the fumble for keys, the click of the latch, and finally, the definitive sound of the door closing. The house sighed into silence, a silence that was no longer peaceful, but pregnant with possibility. My possibility. I looked at my reflection in the dark window over the sink. The eyes that looked back were red-rimmed but steady. The woman in the reflection was a stranger, but she was mine, and she had work to do. I saw the entire, ugly landscape of his betrayal laid out before me. It wasn't a single act. It was a country he had been secretly building for months, with its own borders and rules, and I was only now being granted a visa to see its ruins. The words were simple, but they landed on the foundation of a dread I had been building all morning. Asterisk here. Our house. When you weren't here, asterisk, it was the final, sickening confirmation of a violation I had already felt in my bones. My stomach, which had been a tight knot of suspicion, now turned with a violent lurch that had nothing to do with nausea and everything to do with the desecration of a sanctuary I already knew was lost. Here, I managed to choke out, the words scraping my throat raw. In our house? In our bed. He shook his head, a frantic, jerky motion. Only in the office. She needed some documents.
Lies.
They weren't even good lies. They were the flimsy, transparent lies of a man who had gotten so comfortable in his deceit he'd forgotten how to build a proper alibi. How could I trust a single word that left his mouth now? Every shared memory, every past promise, was suddenly suspect, retroactively poisoned. The foundation of our 22 years wasn't just cracked, it was revealed to be built on quicksand. And she took the opportunity to search through my belongings. I continued, my voice gaining a thin, sharp edge as I steered the conversation back to the one violation that felt somehow more intimate than the physical one. To steal my grandmother's recipe. My voice trembled for the first time, the dam of my icy composure finally developing a hairline fracture. He could have the affairs, the hotels, the secret dinners. But the recipe? It wasn't just a recipe, Ricardo. It was memory. It was legacy. It was the last thing that connected me to Grandma Helena, the last thing she trusted me with. I could see her hands, gnarled with arthritis but still steady as she guided mine, showing me how to cut the butter into the flour just so. I could smell the cinnamon and sugar on her apron, feel the warmth of her kitchen. That girl, that Mariana, hadn't just stolen a list of ingredients. She had shoved her way into that sacred memory and left her grubby fingerprints all over it. Ricardo, blind and stupid to the end, tried to minimize it. He shrugged, a helpless, infuriating little gesture, and said, "It's just a recipe, Laura."
Wrong.
It was the absolute worst thing he could have said. In those 4 words, he dismissed not only my grief but my entire history, my lineage, the parts of me that existed long before he ever entered the picture. He reduced a lifetime of love and tradition to a mere formula, something that could be copied and replicated by any stranger with access to my private drawers. A cold, clear fury washed through me, scouring away the last of the shock and the tremors. My vision sharpened until I could see every pore on his face, every flicker of guilt and annoyance in his eyes. Just a recipe, I repeated, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper. Is that what you think this is? This was the pie I made for you when you got the promotion at your first firm. This was the pie I made the Sunday after we buried your father because you said it was the only thing that tasted like home. This was the pie I made for every birthday, every anniversary, every single time you needed comfort. I took a step toward him, and he actually flinched. You gave her the key to my world, Ricardo. You handed her the map to my history, my heart, and she helped herself to the treasures inside. And you stood by and let her. You watched her put on my apron and play house in my kitchen, and you called it love. I looked at him, pale and speechless in the hallway we'd painted together the summer Lucas was born, a vibrant yellow we'd chosen because it was the color of sunshine and hope. Now, it just looked sickly. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that the woman who had walked up the stairs minutes ago was gone. In her place was someone new, someone harder, someone who was just beginning to understand the rules of this new, brutal game he had started. Get out, I said, the words quiet but absolute, leaving no room for negotiation. He blinked, confused, as if I were speaking a foreign language. Laura, we need to get out of this house. Now. I didn't shout. The calm was back, but it was the calm of a glacier, immense and unstoppable. You don't get to stand in the home I made and explain how you helped destroy it. You forfeited that right the moment you let her root through my nightstand. Where am I supposed to go? He asked, and the sheer childishness of the question, the utter lack of preparedness for the consequences of his own actions, almost made me laugh. Almost. That, I said, turning my back on him and walking toward the kitchen, the epicenter of this earthquake, is no longer my problem. I didn't wait to hear the door close. I walked to the kitchen sink, my hands gripping the cool, hard porcelain, and I listened. I listened to the heavy, defeated tread of his footsteps on the hardwood we'd chosen together. I listened to the fumble for keys in the ceramic bowl by the door, a bowl I'd made in a pottery class a lifetime ago. I listened to the click of the latch, and finally, the definitive, resonant sound of the front door closing, a period at the end of a 22-year sentence. The house sighed into a profound silence. It was no longer the peaceful quiet of an empty nest, but a silence that was pregnant, humming with a terrifying and exhilarating possibility. My possibility. I looked at my reflection in the dark window over the sink, the lights of the kitchen turning the glass into a mirror. The eyes that looked back were red-rimmed but steady, the pupils dark and wide with resolve. The woman in the reflection was a stranger, her face etched with a new harshness, her mouth set in a line I didn't recognize. But she was mine. I had forged her in the fire of this betrayal, and she was stronger than I had ever been. And she had work to do. My gaze fell upon the pie, still sitting on the counter, like a taunt. I walked over to it, this golden brown symbol of everything I had lost. I didn't throw it away. Not yet. Instead, I picked up the knife, the same one that had fallen from my trembling fingers what felt like a lifetime ago, and I cut a single clean slice. I lifted it to my mouth and took a bite, chewing slowly, analytically. It was perfect. The crust was flaky, the apples tender and spiced exactly right. She had learned well. She had copied the instructions perfectly. But as I swallowed, I knew with every fiber of my being that she had missed the most important ingredient. It wasn't written on the card. It was the love, the history, the struggle, the joy, the thousands of Sundays that had gone into it. That she could never steal. That was still mine. And it was the one thing he could never take from me. I wrapped the rest of the pie in plastic, my movements methodical. It wasn't evidence of my defeat. It was the first piece of evidence in my resurrection. "Get out of this house," I said, my voice low and trembling.
Now.
"Laura, let's talk like adults." I stared at her, my silence a heavier accusation than any scream could ever be. The glacier-like calm I had maintained did not crack. It deepened, the cold settling into the very foundation of the room. He took a step back, genuinely surprised by my outburst. I had screamed before, of course, in moments of raw pain or sudden fear, but this was different, a storm born from calculated fury rather than raw pain. In 22 years, I had always been the understanding wife, the one who kept calm, the one who solved problems without drama. I was the soothing balm, the quiet harbor. Now I was the storm. "You have 5 minutes to leave this house," I said, my voice returning to a deadly calm that was far more terrifying than the scream. It was the calm of a decision made, of a line drawn in the sand and then set on fire. 5 minutes before I call Lucas and Marina and tell them what their father did. I saw the panic flash in his eyes, bright and unmistakable. The children. He didn't want the children to know. How interesting. He could desecrate our home, our bed, our history, but he was terrified of his own children's judgment. The hypocrisy was so vast it was almost impressive. He opened his mouth, probably to plead, to negotiate, to deploy one of the dozens of tactics he used in his business dealings. But I saw the words die on his lips as he looked at my face. There was no negotiation to be had here. This wasn't a business transaction. This was an eviction. "Laura, please," he finally managed, his voice thin. "Where will I go?" A bitter laugh escaped me, sharp and short. "Try her apartment. Or a hotel. You seem to be an expert on those lately. The clock is ticking, Ricardo. 4.5 minutes. He stared at me for a long moment, as if truly seeing me for the first time in years. The woman who had packed his lunches, who had waited up with a warm dinner, who had folded his socks and listened to his office dramas. That woman was gone. In her place stood a stranger with steel in her spine and ice in her veins. He must have seen the finality in my eyes because his shoulders slumped in defeat. He turned and walked out of our bedroom, his footsteps heavy on the landing. I didn't move. I stood rooted to the spot, listening to the sounds of him downstairs. The jingle of his keys, the rustle as he grabbed his jacket from the hook by the door, the soft thud of the front door closing. Then, the sound I had been waiting for, the engine of his car starting and fading away down the street. Silence. It was a different silence than the one I'd grown accustomed to since the kids left. This wasn't the quiet of an empty nest. This was the silence after a bomb is detonated, the ringing, Hollow quiet where the world has just been fundamentally rearranged. And in that silence, I finally collapsed. The strength that had held me upright evaporated, and my legs gave way. I sank to the floor, the plush carpet of our bedroom scratching against my cheeks. And then the tears came. They weren't gentle tears of sadness. They were great, heaving sobs that tore from my chest, racking my entire body. I cried for the 22 years, for the Sunday mornings making apple pie, for the nights I waited awake while he worked late. I cried for the naive girl I had been, who believed in the fairy tale of forever. I cried for the shared jokes, the Christmases, the way he used to bring me a single flower for no reason at all. I cried for the future we had planned, the trips we would take, the grandchildren we would spoil, the quiet retirement growing old together in this house. Each memory was a shard of glass in my throat. The pain was a physical thing, a crushing weight on my lungs, making it hard to breathe. I curled into a ball on the floor, letting the waves of grief wash over me. I allowed it. I deserved this moment of complete, unfettered devastation. But as suddenly as it had begun, the storm passed. The sobs subsided into shaky breaths, and the tears slowed. I pushed myself up, wiping my face with the back of my hand, leaving salty tracks on my skin. I looked around the room, our room. The bed we'd shared for over 2 decades. The linen sheets I bought on sale. The pillows arranged just so. It all looked like a stage set now, a carefully constructed diorama of a life that no longer existed. A cold clarity began to seep into the spaces the tears had vacated.
This wasn't the end.
This was the beginning. I stood up, my legs still unsteady but determined. I walked to the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face, staring at my reflection in the mirror. My eyes were swollen and red-rimmed, but they were steady. The pupils were dark and wide with a resolve I hadn't seen in years. The woman looking back at me was a stranger, her face etched with a new harshness, her mouth set in a firm line. But she was mine. I had forged her in the fire of this betrayal, and she was stronger than I had ever been. My hand trembled as I reached for the pie, this golden brown symbol of everything I had lost, but I didn't throw it away. Not yet. I lifted the slice to my mouth and took a bite, chewing slowly, analytically.
It was perfect.
The crust was flaky, the apples tender and spiced exactly right. The taste was a ghost on my tongue, a perfect echo of a recipe I thought I had taken with me to the grave. She had learned too well. I swallowed, and the taste was hollow. The recipe was perfect, the execution flawless, but the soul of it was gone. I wrapped the rest of the pie in plastic, my movements methodical. It wasn't evidence of my defeat. It was the first piece of evidence in my resurrection. Then I began to clean. I scrubbed the countertop where the pie had sat. I washed the mixing bowl, the measuring spoons, the rolling pin. I took the apron, my apron, the one with the cherries, and stuffed it deep into the trash on top of the pie. I cleaned every surface, erasing every physical trace of her, of them, of what had happened here. With every swipe of the cloth, I was reclaiming my space, my kitchen, my home. When I was done, the kitchen gleamed, sterile and scentless. It was a blank slate. I stood in the center of the room, my hands on my hips, breathing in the clean smell of lemon disinfectant. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound. He thought this would break me. He thought I would crumble, forgive, and forget. He had no idea who he was dealing with. The quiet, understanding Laura was gone. The woman who was left was going to fight. And she was going to win. He left. I heard the door slam downstairs, a percussive, final sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house we had built. I heard the car start, the engine fading down the street, taking the ghost of the man I thought I knew with it. The tears fell then, not for the fresh wound, but for the 22 years that led to it. I cried for the Sunday mornings dusted with flour and the scent of cinnamon, for the woman who had built her entire world within these 4 walls and called it a kingdom. The salt of my tears stained the duvet cover I'd chosen with such care, now a bitter emblem of a future that was ash in my mouth. But the tears, for all their violence, lasted only a few minutes. They were the death rattle of the old Laura. Because in the midst of that shattering pain, something else was growing, something cold and hard and sharp, a diamond core of determination. It was as if every tear that fell watered this new, stubborn seed. I wiped my face with the heels of my hands, the skin feeling tight and new. I took a deep, shuddering breath that filled my lungs not with grief, but with purpose. I descended into the silent house, a tomb where the familiar creak of the floorboards felt like a mockery, and went straight for the traitorous pie, still sitting on the white marble countertop in all its golden perfection. Without hesitation, I picked up the whole damn thing, the plate cool and smooth in my hands, carried it to the trash can, and shoved it down, pressing its perfect crust into the coffee grounds and eggshells from this morning's breakfast, a mundane burial for a sacred thing. It was the first act of reclamation. Then I began to clean. I wasn't just tidying. I was performing an exorcism. I filled the sink with scalding water and lemon-scented soap, the steam rising to meet my heated face. I scrubbed the countertop where the pie had sat until the marble gleamed, sterile and anonymous. I washed the mixing bowl, the measuring spoons, the rolling pin, every utensil that girls' hands had defiled. I saw it all in my mind's eye. Her, laughing, flirting, using my tools in my sanctuary. My hands worked faster, scrubbing with a ferocity that made my muscles ache. I took the apron, my apron, the one with the cheerful cherries Marina had picked out for me, and I didn't just throw it away. I balled it up, the fabric still faintly smelling of her cheap perfume, and I stuffed it deep into the trash, burying it beneath the physical weight of the pie she had so proudly made. It was a ritual. With every swipe of the cloth, every spray of disinfectant, I was erasing her. I was scouring away the memory of their laughter, the sound of their kiss, the very air they had shared in this room. I wiped down the refrigerator door, my gaze skipping over the smiling family photos, now a gallery of lies. Not today. I couldn't deal with that today. Today was about purging. And while I cleaned, I planned. The methodical, circular motion of my hand on the counter became the whetstone for my thoughts. If Ricardo thought I would simply accept this, if he expected tears and pleading followed by a weary, wounded forgiveness, he didn't know me. Not the me that was being forged in this fire. He had mistaken my kindness for weakness, my dedication for naivete. He had forgotten that before I was his wife, before I was Lucas and Marina's mother, I was Laura. I was the woman who had worked 2 jobs to put him through his MBA. I was the one who could balance a budget and negotiate a contractor's price. He had gotten so used to me managing the quiet background of his life that he'd forgotten I was capable of waging a war. My mind, sharpened by betrayal, began to itemize my arsenal. The house was in both our names, but I had the proof of his infidelity within it, a fact any lawyer would salivate over. I had sacrificed my teaching career to raise our children, a point of leverage in any settlement. I knew where the financial documents were, the passwords to the joint accounts, the records of investments he probably thought I never looked at. For 22 years, I had been the archivist of this family, and now that meticulous record-keeping would be my weapon. When I was done, the kitchen gleamed. It was a blank slate, smelling sharply of lemons and bleach, devoid of any warmth, any history. It was perfect. I stood in the center of the room, my hands on my hips, my breathing even. The only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator, a steady, mechanical drone. This was no longer just a kitchen. It was my command center. The quiet, understanding Laura was gone, buried under the rubble of her own naivete. The woman who was left, the one with the hollowed-out chest and the diamond core resolve, was going to fight. And for the first time since I'd walked in on them hours ago, a sliver of something that wasn't pain cut through me. It was the cold, clean thrill of certainty. I was going to win. On Saturday morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't had in years. The sleep had been thin, fractured by images of apple pie and a blonde ponytail, but it had been enough to wash away the last vestiges of hysterical grief. What remained was a cold, sharp focus. I made coffee, strong and bitter, the way I now preferred it, and sat at the pristine kitchen table with my laptop. The room smelled of lemons and bleach, a scent I now associated not with cleanliness, but with erasure. Ricardo hadn't come back. He was probably at his mother's apartment, playing the misunderstood son.
Good. Better that way.
His absence was a gift, filling the house with a productive silence. First, I called Beatrice. My best friend since school. Her number was etched in my memory, a lifeline I hadn't needed to use in years. Not like this. Bea, I need the name of that lawyer you used in your divorce. The words were calm, procedural. They didn't sound like my own. There was a pause on the other end of the line, a beat of pure, unadulterated shock. Laura? What happened? He cheated on me. With his secretary. In our house. I delivered the facts cleanly, like a news bulletin. There was no tremor, no tears. Just the stark, ugly truth. I heard Bea hold her breath, a sharp, pained intake. Then, the explosion. That son of a bitch. The words were a guttural promise of solidarity. I'm coming over right now. And she hung up, no questions, no platitudes. That was Bea. Action was her native language. While I waited, the hum of the laptop filled the silence. I opened a new document and titled it, with a grim sense of irony, Project Phoenix. Then I began making a list. Assets. Not the sentimental ones, the family photos, the worn spot on the sofa, but the cold, hard financial ones. The house, the 2 cars, the joint savings and checking accounts. The investment portfolio I had helped him build, reading prospectuses by nightlight while nursing a baby. The shares in his company, a venture I had funded with my teacher's salary in those early, lean years. My fingers flew across the keyboard. 22 years of marriage entitled me to a lot. More than a lot. And I had been the perfect wife. I had abandoned my teaching career to raise the children, to host his business partners, to create the flawless domestic stage upon which he could perform his success. I had been the quiet, competent architect of his comfort. Now it was time to send him the bill for my services. A memory, sharp and unbidden, surfaced. Me at 28, 8 months pregnant with Marina, sitting at this very table with a stack of bills and a calculator. Ricardo had just started his own firm, and money was a constant, gnawing worry. I'd figured out how to stretch a grocery budget to its absolute limit, how to patch a pair of Lucas's tiny jeans for the 3rd time. I had balanced our precarious budget with the focus of a battlefield general. He had forgotten that woman. He'd gotten so used to the comfortable, established life we had now that he'd forgotten the scrappy, resourceful partner who had helped him build it from nothing. The doorbell rang, 2 sharp, insistent chimes. Beatrice stood on the porch, her face a thundercloud of fury and concern. She held a paper bag from my favorite bakery and a cardboard tray with 2 large coffees. She didn't say a word, just walked in, placed the items on the table, and pulled me into a bone-crushing hug. For a second, the dam threatened to break. I felt the hot press of tears behind my eyes, but I swallowed them down. There would be time for that later. Now was the time for strategy. We sat at the table, and I told her everything. The canceled hair appointment, the car parked on the street, the laughter from the kitchen, the sight of Mariana in my cherry print apron, the perfect golden pie, the note signed with that damning M. I told her about Ricardo's pathetic excuses, his attempt to blame our growing apart, his minimization of my grandmother's recipe as just a recipe. Bea listened, her jaw tightening with each new detail. When I finished, she slammed her hand on the table, making the coffee cups jump. Classic. They always blame us. You dedicated your life to that man, Laura. You raised his children, you managed this entire house, you supported every single one of his career decisions. And he repays you by bringing his 25-year-old mistress into your kitchen. She shook her head, her eyes blazing. He's not just a cheater. He's a cliché. And he's going to pay for it. He already is, I said, turning the laptop toward her. I've started the list. Her eyes scanned the document, a slow, approving smile spreading across her face.
Oh, Laura.
This is beautiful. She pulled out her phone. The lawyer's name is Enrique Montero. He's a shark. A very expensive, very well-dressed shark. He took Carlos for everything but his favorite golf clubs, and it was worth every penny. She tapped the screen and forwarded me his contact information. Call him first thing Monday. Don't wait. I wasn't planning on it. We spent the next hour fortifying our position. Bia helped me remember assets I'd forgotten, a small vacation fund, a royalty payment from a patent he'd filed years ago. She coached me on what to say to the lawyer, how to present myself as the wronged but formidable party, not the victim. You need to be ice, Laura, she said, stirring her coffee. Not fire. Ice is calculating. Ice is patient. Fire burns out quickly. Ice endures. I looked around my lemon-scented command center, at the list of assets on my screen, at the fierce loyalty in my friend's eyes. The quiet, understanding Laura was gone, buried under the rubble of a life she thought was real. The woman who was left had a hollowed-out chest, but also a diamond core of resolve. Ricardo had thought he was trading me in for a newer model, a girl who could bake him a pie. He had no idea he'd awakened the general who had once financed his entire empire. He had forgotten I was capable of waging a war. And as I sat there with my best friend, the bitter coffee on my tongue tasting like resolve, I knew with a cold, clean certainty that I was not just going to fight. I was going to win. And my share was going to be everything. Beatrice's hand remained a warm, steady anchor over my own as the last of my confession faded. Then we adapt, she said, her voice losing its sorrow and gaining a new, sharp edge. Tell me everything about the security layout. We need to find a new way in. And you know what's worse? I said, the anger I'd suppressed now a live wire in my veins. He blamed me, said we grew apart, that I was too busy with the house, with the kids, even after they'd left. Bia didn't just nod sympathetically. She slammed her free hand on the marble countertop with a crack that made the coffee cups rattle. Classic. They always blame us. You dedicated your life to that man, Laura. You raised his children, managed this entire house, supported every single one of his career decisions. You were the silent, goddamn foundation of his entire life. And he pays you back like this? By bringing some child into your kitchen to bake him a pie with a recipe he knew was sacred. Her words weren't just comfort. They were a truth serum, dissolving the last remnants of my doubt. She was right. Every syllable was a hammer striking the anvil of my resolve. I looked at my friend, at the fierce, unyielding light in her eyes. This was the same woman who, 3 years ago, had been a hollowed-out shell after her own divorce. Now, she was a force of nature, rebuilt, refined, and radiating a strength that I desperately needed to borrow. In that moment, the decision crystallized within me, not as a desperate reaction, but as a strategic, inevitable conclusion. This wouldn't just be a divorce. A divorce was a legal transaction, a simple severing of ties. This would be a reclamation, a taking back of everything that was mine, my dignity, my time, my financial worth, the very life I had built brick by brick while he was off building his career. Ricardo wouldn't just lose a wife, he would pay. He would pay for every tear I'd cried into my pillow, for every lie he'd spun so easily over his shoulder as he walked out the door, for every single one of the goddamn apple pies I had made for him over 22 years. He forgot who I was, Bia, I said, my voice dropping to a low, steady register. He saw the wife, the mother, the homemaker. He forgot the woman who worked 2 jobs to put him through his MBA. The woman who sat up with him until 3 a.m., helping him craft his first business proposals. The woman who understood compound interest and asset portfolios better than he did. A slow, grim smile spread across Bia's face. So remind him. I stood up, my legs steady for the first time since I'd walked into this kitchen yesterday. I walked to my laptop, opened it, and created a new document. The blank screen was my battlefield. I typed a title at the top. Assets and ammunition. Start talking, I commanded. For the next 2 hours, we were generals plotting a campaign. The coffee grew cold, forgotten. Bia, with her recent experience, was my chief strategist. The joint savings and checking accounts are obvious, she said. leaning over my shoulder. But what about the investment portfolio? The one with the financial advisor he's so chummy with. Charles Redding, I said, the name tasting sour. Ricardo always said he was too complicated for me to bother with. My fingers flew across the keyboard. Noted. The company, Bia pressed. He incorporated it after you were married. That makes it marital property. Do you know the valuation? I have a rough idea from the last time he tried to secure a loan against it. I'll get the exact figures. I created a subheading, Ricardo Silva Consultoria, Valuation and Shares. What about the vacation fund for Italy? You were always saving for that. The Roman holiday fund, I murmured, the dream now a bitter memory. It's a separate money market account. I added it to the list. Each entry was a piece of my life, a brick in the wall I was building between my future and his past. Then Bia's eyes lit up. The patent. I looked up confused. What patent?
Laura.
The water filtration system he came up with for that startup, 15 years ago? It never took off, but he licensed the patent to that big eco company. There were royalty payments for years. They must have gone into an account somewhere. A memory, dusty and long forgotten, surfaced. Excited, talking about direct deposits into a new account for tax purposes. I had been 8 months pregnant with Marina, my mind on cribs and diapers. I just nodded. I'd trusted him. My God, Bia. I'd completely forgotten. I added it to the list, my heart pounding with a grim thrill. This was what he'd counted on, that I was too busy, too trusting, too buried in the domestic to notice the financial sleight of hand. When the list was a formidable scroll of bullet points and subpoints, Bia pulled out her phone. Okay, enough recon. Time to call in the air strike. She tapped the screen. The lawyer's name is Enrique Montero. He's a shark. A very expensive, very well-dressed shark. He took Carlos for everything but his favorite golf clubs, and it was worth every penny. She forwarded me the contact information. Call him first thing Monday. Don't wait. Don't give Ricardo time to get his story straight or start hiding assets. I wasn't planning on it, I said, and the cold certainty in my voice was entirely new. She stood to leave, pulling me into a fierce hug. Remember, she whispered into my ear, her voice a steel blade wrapped in velvet. You need to be ice, Laura. Not fire. Ice is calculating. Ice is patient. Fire burns out quickly. Ice endures. It waits. And then it shatters everything in its path. After she left, the silence in the house was different. It wasn't the hollow, accusing silence from before. It was the quiet of a command center after the battle plans have been drawn. The lemon-scented cleaner from my frantic scrubbing still hung in the air, but now it smelled like a fresh start, like a sterilized operating room before a precise, necessary surgery. I looked around my kitchen, at the list glowing on my laptop screen, and I felt the final shift within me. The quiet, understanding Laura was gone, buried under the rubble of the life she had thought was real. The woman who was left had a hollowed-out chest where her heart used to be, but in its place was a diamond core of resolve. Ricardo had thought he was trading me in for a newer model, a girl who could bake him a pie. He had no idea he'd awakened the general who had once financed his entire empire. He had forgotten that before I was a wife and mother, I was a strategist. He had forgotten I was capable of waging a war. And as I sat there alone, the bitter aftertaste of coffee on my tongue now tasting like pure, unadulterated resolve, I knew with a cold, clean certainty that settled deep in my bones. My knuckles whitened around the hilt, the blade feeling not like steel, but a promise I had already made to myself. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I was going to win. And my share was going to be everything. Monday, 9 in the morning, I was in the office of Dr. Enrique Montero, the best divorce lawyer in town according to Beatrice. The office was a testament to quiet, expensive power, dark wood, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with legal volumes, and a view of the city that seemed to put everything in its proper, small place. He was a man in his early 50s, with a distinguished sweep of gray hair and an attentive gaze that didn't wander, that made you feel you were the only case in the world. He listened to my story without interrupting, his pen scratching against a yellow legal pad. He didn't flinch when I described walking into my own kitchen, didn't raise an eyebrow at the stolen recipe. He just wrote, a steady, methodical recording of the demolition of my life. When I finished, the words hanging in the air between us, he leaned back in his leather chair, the material sighing softly under his weight. Mrs. Laura, he began, his voice calm and measured, your husband committed adultery inside the marital home. This, added to your 22 years of marriage and the fact that you abandoned your career to care for the family, gives us a very strong position. A very strong position indeed. He didn't offer empty condolences. He didn't tell me he was sorry. He laid out the battlefield with the cool precision of a seasoned general. He explained the division of assets, the difference between community property and what was mine alone. He talked about spousal support, not as a handout, but as a recalibration of the economic partnership I had invested in for over 2 decades. Document everything, he instructed. Every call, every message, every accidental meeting he might try to engineer. Save voicemails.
Keep a log.
Assume every interaction is being recorded, because on our end it will be. I mentioned the letter, the one signed with that damning. I showed him the photo on my phone, the slanted, feminine handwriting a stark contrast against my white marble countertop. Perfect, he said, a flicker of something akin to satisfaction in his eyes.
Keep documenting.
We'll need everything. I left his office clutching a folder of my own, filled with forms to complete and a list of financial documents to gather. The morning sun was bright, glinting off the windshields of passing cars, but it didn't feel harsh. It felt illuminating. For the first time in days, I felt something like hope stirring in the hollow of my chest. But it wasn't the fragile hope for reconciliation, for a tearful apology that could magically rebuild the shattered vase of our marriage. No, this was different. This hope was cold, metallic, and sharp-edged. It was the hope for justice. I walked to my car, my steps measured and firm on the pavement. Beatrice's words echoed in my mind, a mantra that was quickly becoming my new religion. Asterisk, you need to be ice, Laura. Not fire. Ice is calculating. Ice is patient. Asterisk, I had been fire in the kitchen, a brief, blazing inferno of hurt and rage. Now, sitting behind the steering wheel, I felt the freeze setting in, a glacial calm that slowed my heart and cleared my vision. My first stop wasn't home. It was the bank. I met with a financial advisor, a serious young woman named Chloe, and using the authority Dr. Montero had assured me I still had, I began the process of separating our joint accounts. I opened new ones in my name only. As the paperwork was processed, I sat in the hushed, carpeted office and started my log, just as the lawyer had instructed. Monday, 10:45 a.m., I wrote in a new, pristine notebook. Asterisk, met with Dr. Enrique Montero. Retained his services. He is confident. 11:30 a.m. at First United Bank. Initiating separation of joint accounts 4451 and 4452. Opening new personal accounts. Asterisk, the act of writing it down, of transforming my chaos into cold, hard facts, was more empowering than any scream or tear had been. This was the language Ricardo understood. Spreadsheets, balances, bottom lines. I would speak it fluently. When I finally returned home, the silence felt different. It wasn't the hollow, accusing silence from before. It was the quiet of a command center after the battle plans have been drawn. I went straight to Ricardo's home office. Asterisk, my asterisk office now, I corrected myself, and began the systematic process of gathering evidence. I printed credit card statements from the last year, my stomach tightening as I saw the patterns Dr. Montero had predicted. Dinners at Le Jardin, a hotel charge for the grand on a weekend he was supposedly at a conference, a receipt from a jewelry store for a necklace I had never seen. Each piece of paper was another brick in the wall I was building between my old life and my new one. I found the company credit card statements in a locked filing cabinet. The key was in the small porcelain dish on his desk, the one Marina had made him in second grade. The irony was so thick I could taste it. I photocopied everything, the machine whirring and flashing like a faithful accomplice in the otherwise still house. As I worked, a specific memory surfaced unbidden. It was from about 8 months ago. Ricardo had been particularly distant, buried in his phone. I had asked him if everything was okay at work, placing a hand on his shoulder. He had flinched, just slightly, a tiny recoil I had dismissed as stress. Now, I recognized it for what it was, the physical manifestation of a guilty conscience. I had been so busy smoothing over the cracks in our life, so dedicated to maintaining the facade of a happy marriage, that I had ignored the foundation crumbling beneath my feet. I wouldn't make that mistake again. I would no longer be the architect of a beautiful lie. I would be the forensic engineer examining its collapse. By late afternoon, the sun slanted through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. I had a neat stack of documents, a timeline sketched in my notebook, and a profound, bone-deep weariness that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. I had excavated the ruins of my marriage and come back with the treasure, the truth. I made a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd eaten 1,000 family meals. The lemon-scented cleaner from my frantic scrubbing still hung in the air, but now it smelled like a fresh start, like a sterilized operating room before a precise, necessary surgery. I looked at the list of assets glowing on my laptop screen, and I felt the final, irrevocable shift within me. The quiet, understanding Laura was gone, buried under the rubble of the life she had thought was real. The woman who was left had a hollowed-out chest where her heart used to be, but in its place was a diamond core of resolve. Ricardo had thought he was trading me in for a newer model, a girl who could bake him a pie. He had no idea he'd awakened the general who had once financed his entire empire from this very kitchen table, balancing ledgers and managing investments when he was too busy chasing the next big deal. He had forgotten that before I was a wife and mother, I was a strategist. He had forgotten I was capable of waging a war. And as I sat there alone, the bitter aftertaste of tea on my tongue now tasting like pure, unadulterated resolve, I knew with a cold, clean certainty that settled deep in my bones. My knuckles tightened around the hilt of the sword, the leather grip groaning in protest. I met the captain's glare, a silent promise passing between us, and shifted my weight into a ready stance. There would be no more words. My fingers tightened around the worn grip of the controller, a familiar extension of my will. As the final sequence of symbols flashed on the screen, my hands moved without conscious thought, a fluid dance of practiced precision that I had performed 1,000 times in the dark of my room. The victory chime was merely a formality. The outcome had been decided the moment my focus narrowed to the space between me and the pixels, a problem I had already solved in my mind. The phone vibrated against the granite countertop, a persistent, angry buzz that seemed to echo through the newly sterilized kitchen. Ricardo's name flashed on the screen, a stark reminder of the life that was, a life that was now officially over. I watched it with a detached curiosity, as if observing a scientific experiment. How many times would he try? The first call died. A minute of silence, then the screen lit up again. The same name. The same plea for attention I had answered for 22 years. This time, I didn't feel anger or pain, just a profound, bone-deep weariness. I let it go to voicemail. The third time, he gave up on calling. A text message bloomed on the screen, the words simple and predictable. *, Laura, we need to talk. It can't end like this. Think of the children. * of the children. The classic, cowardly gambit. A pressure point he assumed was still tender. But Lucas was 23, a man building his own life in another state. Marina was 21, living with her boyfriend and navigating the complexities of adult relationships. They weren't children who needed to be shielded from messy realities. They were adults who deserved the truth. His attempt to use them as a shield, to cloak his own transgressions in the banner of family unity, was the final confirmation that the man I had married was a stranger. He didn't see them as individuals. He saw them as leverage. My fingers, which had trembled so violently just days ago when I held the knife, were now steady as I picked up the phone. I didn't scroll through my contacts. I knew the number by heart, a sequence etched into my soul from the first day he learned to dial a phone. I took a deep breath, the scent of lemon cleaner filling my lungs, and pressed call. Lucas answered on the second ring. "Hey, Mom. What's up?" His voice was easy, light. The sound of a normal Friday afternoon in a normal life. "Son, I need to tell you something." The words were calm, measured. I had rehearsed this moment in my head, building a fortress of composure around the raw nerve of the truth. His tone shifted instantly. I could picture him straightening up, the easy smile fading from his face. "Mom, what's wrong? Are you okay?" "I am," I said, and for the first time, I truly meant it. I was standing in the wreckage, but I was okay. "But your father and I are getting divorced." The silence on the other end was heavy, thick with the shattering of a foundational myth. Then a sharp, inhaled breath.
Why?
What happened? I didn't sugarcoat it. I didn't use euphemisms like "we grew apart" or "it's complicated." I gave him the unvarnished, brutal truth, the same truth that had been served to me on a marble countertop with a side of apple pie. He was having an affair with his secretary, Mariana. For 6 months. I found them here in our kitchen 2 days ago. She was making him grandma's apple pie. I heard a low, guttural curse, a sound of pure, male disgust that was somehow more validating than any tearful sympathy. That, "Mom, I'm sorry. You didn't deserve this. Not any of it." His voice was tight with a rage I recognized as my own, refined and sharpened. His words were a balm, a warm, steadying hand on my shoulder across the miles.
He was on my side.
The first line of defense had held. We talked for a few more minutes, his questions practical and pointed. "Are you safe? Is he still there? Do you have a lawyer?" My son, the strategist. He was my son through and through. I assured him I had everything in hand, promising to keep him updated before we hung up. The call to Marina was harder. She was my sensitive girl, her emotions always closer to the surface. Her hello was a cheerful lilt that already made my heart ache for what I was about to do. "Sweetheart," I began, using the same opening. Her response was identical to her brother's, the same immediate shift from light to dark.
"Mom?
"What is it?" When I told her, the dam broke. I heard the sharp, hiccuping sob, the sound of a childhood idol cracking into 1,000 irreparable pieces. "Oh, Mom, no. How could he? And in our house." The violation, for her, was spatial, personal. The sanctuary of her childhood home had been defiled. "Mom, do you need anything? I'm coming home. I'll pack a bag right now." The ferocity of her love, her immediate instinct to protect me, was a different kind of warmth than Lucas's steady rage. It was a blazing fire. "You don't need to, sweetheart," I said, my voice soft but firm. "I need you to be strong right where you are. But I need you to know the truth. Your father, he's going to try to tell you his version. He's going to say it was a mistake, that we grew apart, that it's not what I think. I need you to know what I saw. I need you to know that it is exactly what I think." She sniffled, and I could almost see her wiping her tears away, her jaw setting in a way I knew meant her sadness was being rapidly eclipsed by a righteous, protective fury. "He brought her into our kitchen," she repeated, her voice trembling but clear. "He let her wear your apron? He let her steal Grandma's recipe." Each question was another nail in the coffin of her father's character. "Yes, honey, he did." "Then he's a monster," she declared, and the finality in her tone was a gift. She had chosen. They both had. After the calls, the house felt different. It was no longer just my fortress, it was our fortress. The truth was out, and it had fortified the walls. The silence was no longer empty, it was resonant with the echoes of their support. I walked to the living room and looked at the large family portrait hanging over the fireplace, a photo from 5 years ago, all of us smiling, a perfect, curated lie. But now I didn't see a lie. I saw Lucas's steady gaze and Marina's fierce grin, and I saw myself, the architect of that happiness. Ricardo was just a figure in the background, already fading. He had told me to think of the children. And I had. I had thought of them as the adults they were, with a right to the truth and the capacity for moral judgment. He had thought of them as pawns. That was the fundamental difference between us now. He was still playing a game of appearances, of damage control. I was waging a war for reality. And with my children standing beside me in that reality, I knew, with a certainty that settled deep into the newly hollowed-out spaces of my soul, that I had already won the most important battle. The following weeks were a delicate, macabre dance of documentation and discoveries. With Dr. Enrique's help, a forensic key was turned in the digital lock of our shared life, and I was granted access to the financial arteries that had once sustained our marriage. I sat at the kitchen table, my laptop glowing in the dim morning light, and began to trace the path of his betrayal through our bank statements. It was an archaeological dig through the ruins of my own life. And that's when I found it. The hidden stratum of his deceit. The transfers were the first layer. Small at first, a few hundred here and there, client dinners, he would have called them. Then they grew larger, bolder. 500, 1,000, all flowing into an account I didn't know, an account that belonged to a ghost in our financial machine. Then came the credit card statements from an account he'd told me he'd closed. The charges were a detailed itinerary of his double life. Expensive dinners at intimate, dimly lit restaurants we never went to together, the kind with names in French and menus without prices. A charge from a jewelry store, a boutique I'd pointed out to him once, wistfully. A necklace I never received. And the hotels. So many hotels. Not just the cheap, anonymous motels by the highway, but nice ones with spas and room service. The kind of places we used to go for anniversaries. 6 months of expenses, of financial lies meticulously recorded. He wasn't just cheating on me emotionally, desecrating the sanctity of our home and my grandmother's memory. He was using our money, the money I had scrimped and saved to build, the money I had indirectly earned by managing our home so he could focus on his career, to finance his affair with Mariana. He was paying for their fantasy with the currency of our reality. Each discovery was a fresh, precise stab, a cold blade of confirmation. But as Dr. Enrique had predicted, the pain was rapidly being cauterized by a grim sense of purpose. Each receipt was a bullet. Each transfer was a cannonball. I compiled it all, creating folders on my desktop with a calm, methodical detachment that surprised me. Infidelity expenses, Mariana evidence, financial drain. Dr. Enrique was loving it. "This is gold, Mrs. Laura," he said over the phone, his voice a low, satisfied hum. "Pure gold. This establishes a clear pattern of dissipation of marital assets." He wasn't just hiding the affair, he was actively funding it with community property. Armed with this new, irrefutable arsenal, I felt a shift in my own posture. The waiting was over. I was no longer the wounded wife hiding in her bedroom. I was the warden of my own life, and he was the trespasser. So when Ricardo finally showed up at the house a few days later, sending a terse text about wanting to get some things, I was ready. I didn't hide. I was there, waiting in the living room, seated in my armchair, as if it were a throne. I had chosen my clothes carefully, not the comfortable sweats of a grieving woman, but dark-washed jeans and a crisp, white blouse. Armor. He let himself in with his key, and the sound of it in the lock felt like a violation all over again. He looked tired, older, the lines on his face deeper than I remembered. He'd always been so meticulously put together, but today his shirt was slightly wrinkled, and there was a shadow of stubble on his jaw. The sight gave me no pleasure, only a cold flicker of contempt. "Laura," he said, his voice soft, placating. He stood awkwardly near the doorway, a stranger in his own foyer. "Can we talk?" I looked at him, my expression neutral, my hands resting calmly in my lap. I let the silence stretch, watching him squirm. This small power was intoxicating. "Go ahead." He took a tentative step forward, but stopped when I didn't invite him further. "I broke up with her," he said, the words tumbling out as if he'd been rehearsing them. As if this was the magic phrase that would dissolve all the evidence, all the pain. I ended it. It was a mistake, a moment of weakness. 22 years, Laura. Is it worth throwing it all away over one mistake? I looked at him, really looked, and saw the profound flaw in his logic. He still believed this was a single, contained incident, a blemish on an otherwise perfect portrait. He couldn't comprehend that his one mistake was, in fact, 1,000 tiny, deliberate choices, a cascading series of betrayals that had eroded the very foundation of our life together.
He saw an affair.
I saw the systematic dismantling of my world. "Ricardo," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "You didn't break up with her for me. You broke up because you got caught." He started to protest, his hands fluttering in a familiar gesture of frustration, but I held up a single hand, and he fell silent. The dynamic had irrevocably shifted. "And I'm not the one throwing away 22 years, I continued, each word measured and cold. "You did. You chose. Every time you took her to one of those expensive hotels, every time you spent our money on a necklace for her, every time you stood in this very kitchen and watched her wear my apron and steal my grandmother's recipe to impress you, you were making a choice. You chose to throw it away.
Piece by piece.
Dollar by dollar." I saw the arguments die in his eyes. He couldn't refute the receipts, the transfers, the photographic evidence of the pie and the note. The truth was a wall he couldn't scale. His shoulders slumped in defeat, the performance over. "The lawyer will be in touch with the formal separation papers," I said, standing up to signal the end of the conversation. "I suggest you get one too. A good one. You're going to need him." He stared at me, a complex mix of shock, anger, and something that might have been respect dawning in his eyes. He was finally seeing the woman I had become, the woman his actions had forged. He nodded once, a short, sharp movement, then turned and left without another word, without taking any of the things he'd come for. I listened to the door close, a final, solid sound. The house settled back into its new, truthful silence. I walked to the window and watched his car pull away from the curb, a strange and powerful certainty settling deep within me. The dance was over. The war was just beginning, and for the first time, I knew, with every fiber of my being, that I was going to win it. "O advogado de par contraria appresente uma moção para descartar o caso, alegando falta de jurístico. Enquanto o juiz analisava os autos, silencio passado toma conta da sala, cada segundo alongando a agonia da espera." I looked at him, really looked, maybe for the first time in years. I studied the faint lines around his eyes that hadn't been there a decade ago, the slight sag of his jawline, the way his suit jacket hung just a little too loose on his shoulders. He was a man entering the later chapters of his life, and he had chosen to write a tawdry, cliched subplot. When had we become such strangers? When had the man who held my hand during both labors become someone capable of this calculated, prolonged deceit? "Ricardo," I said, my voice unnervingly calm, a flat lake after a storm has passed. "You didn't break up with her for me. You broke up with her because you got caught. There's a monumental difference." He started to protest, his mouth opening to release what I was sure would be another stream of self-justifying platitudes, but I held up a single hand, and he fell silent. The dynamic had irrevocably shifted. "And I'm not the one throwing away 22 years, I continued, each word measured and cold, forged in the fire of the last few weeks. "You did. You chose. Every time you took her to that hotel, every time you spent our money on a necklace I never saw, every time you stood in this very kitchen and watched her wear my apron and steal my grandmother's recipe to impress you, you chose." I let the silence hang, heavy and accusatory. "You chose to throw it all away.
Piece by piece.
Dollar by dollar. Recipe by recipe." I saw his attempts to argue die in his eyes. He couldn't refute the receipts, the bank transfers, the photographic evidence of the pie, and the note that was now safely digitized in multiple clouds and hard drives. The truth was a wall he couldn't scale. His shoulders slumped in a performative display of defeat, the final act in his little play of remorse. "The lawyer will be in touch," I said, my tone shifting from personal to procedural. It was no longer about us. It was about the dissolution of a partnership. "I suggest you get one too. A good one." I paused, letting the implications sink in. You're going to need him. He stared at me, a complex mix of shock, anger, and something that might have been a grudging respect dawning in his eyes. He was finally seeing the woman I had become in the crucible of his betrayal, the woman his actions had forged from the ashes of the one he thought he knew. The one who waited, who understood, who kept the peace. That woman was gone. He nodded once, a short, sharp movement of concession, then turned and left without another word, without even taking the stack of mail or the gym bag he'd come for. I listened to the heavy front door close, a final, solid sound that echoed through the bones of the house. The lock clicked into place with a definitive thud that felt more significant than any wedding vow. The house settled back into its new, truthful silence, a silence that was no longer lonely, but spacious and mine. I walked to the large living room window, the one that looked out onto the street where we'd taught the kids to ride their bikes. I watched his silver sedan pull away from the curb, the familiar sight now feeling like the end of a documentary about someone else's life. A strange and powerful certainty settled deep within me, a cold, hard stone of resolve. The dance was over. The war was just beginning, and for the first time, I knew, with every fiber of my being, that I was going to win it. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. A text from Beatrice. Asterisk, you alive? Do I need to bring wine and/or a shovel? Asterisk, a small, genuine smile touched my lips. Asterisk, alive. More than ever. No shovel needed.
Yet.
But come over. I have news. Asterisk, while I waited for her, I didn't sink into the couch to mourn. I moved. I went to our, my home office and powered up the laptop. Dr. Enrique had advised me to start a detailed log. I opened a new document and titled it with today's date. Ricardo came to the house at 3:15 p.m. I typed, my fingers flying across the keyboard. Asterisk stated he had ended the affair with Mariana. Attempted to guilt me by invoking the 22 years. When confronted with the fact that his actions, not mine, destroyed the marriage, he had no rebuttal. He left at 3:38 p.m. I observed no remorse, only regret at being caught. He did not ask about the children. Asterisk, the clinical act of recording it solidified the reality. This was no longer a messy, emotional catastrophe. It was a case. My case. By the time Bia's key turned in the lock, she had insisted on having a spare for emergencies, and this certainly qualified. I had printed out 6 months of credit card statements I'd retrieved from the online portal, the transactions for hotels and boutique restaurants highlighted in angry yellow. Okay, talk, she said, dropping a bottle of Pinot Noir and a bag of takeout from my favorite Thai place onto the table. And don't skip any details. I relayed the entire, brief encounter, mimicking Ricardo's defeated posture and my own icy delivery. Bia listened, her eyes widening with gleeful pride. You're going to need him, she repeated, pouring 2 generous glasses of wine. Laura, that is absolutely legendary. You sounded like a CEO firing an incompetent middle manager. That's essentially what it was, I said, the analogy feeling perfect. I'm terminating his position as my husband for gross misconduct and violation of fiduciary duty. We clinked glasses. The wine was dry and bracing. So, what's the first move? She asked, gesturing to the highlighted statements. First, I meet with Enrique tomorrow to formally file. Then, I said, tapping a finger on a particularly egregious charge from a jewelry store, I find out exactly what he bought her. Enrique says we can subpoena the store records. It's not about the money anymore, Bia. It's about the principle. It's about building an unassailable fortress of facts so that when he inevitably tries to downplay this, to tell his friends it was just a fling, or that I was cold, the entire legal system will be there to call him a liar. Bia grinned. I love this version of you, the avenging angel of suburban justice. I looked around the kitchen, at the clean counters, the trash long emptied of the offending pie, the familiar creak of the floorboards that were mine alone now. The anger was still there, a hot coal in my chest, but it was no longer consuming me. It was fueling me. He thought finding that girl in here would break me. I murmured, more to myself than to Bia. He thought I'd crumble. But all he did was show me the door I needed to walk through. The house felt different. It wasn't just a place of betrayed memories anymore. It was my command center. And I was just getting started. The process was faster than I expected. The mountain of evidence was so solid, so meticulously documented, that it created a kind of legal gravity, pulling the proceedings toward an inevitable conclusion. Ricardo tried to negotiate, of course. He sent messages through his lawyer, pathetic attempts at emotional manipulation about shared history and the children. But Dr. Enrique was a wall of immovable, bespoke-suited relentlessness. He would listen, nod, and then systematically dismantle every plea with a cold, hard fact, a hotel receipt, a jewelry store charge, a screenshot of the yours forever, note. In the end, I got the house. It wasn't just a structure of wood and brick anymore. It was my territory, reclaimed and purified. It was where I had raised my children, where every good memory we had ever forged was embedded in the walls. More than that, it was the very stage of his crime, and my victory felt like a form of spiritual cleansing. I also got half of everything, the savings accounts, the investments, even half of his precious company, the one he'd so often used as an excuse for his absences. Let him see how it felt to have a partner claim their share without putting in the emotional labor. He was furious, a simmering pot of resentment that finally boiled over during one of the final hearings. His face was mottled red, his carefully cultivated composure shattered. "You're destroying me," he hissed across the polished table, the words meant for me alone. The calm that settled over me was absolute. It wasn't an act. "No," I replied, my voice even and clear in the hushed room. "I'm just taking what's rightfully mine. You destroyed yourself." And it was the profound truth. Every decision, from the first clandestine lunch to bringing her into our kitchen, had been his. I was merely the auditor who had finally arrived to collect the debt he had accrued over 6 months of lies. The divorce was finalized 6 months to the day after that fateful Friday. 6 months in which I learned more about the marrow of my own character than in 22 years of marriage. I learned that I could sit across from a man I had loved for most of my adult life and feel nothing but a distant, analytical pity. I learned that the fear of being alone was a phantom, banished by the stark reality that loneliness within a marriage is a far deeper solitude. I learned how to read a financial statement not as a shared dream, but as a battlefield map. The day the papers were signed, I went back to the empty house, my house, and did something I hadn't done since the children were small. I danced in the living room. No music, just the rhythm of my own heartbeat and the swish of my socks on the hardwood floor. I spun in the space where our sofa used to be, the one he always claimed was too floral, and I laughed, a loud, unladylike sound that echoed off the walls. This wasn't a celebration of his downfall, but a baptism for my own beginning. A few days later, a box arrived. It was from Ricardo, left on the porch without a note. Inside, I found a jumble of my things he'd apparently cleared from his new apartment, a hairbrush I'd forgotten, a paperback novel with a bent cover, and at the very bottom, nestled in crumpled newspaper, the cherry print apron. My apron, the one Mariana had been wearing. For a moment, I just stared at it, the cheerful red fruit now a mocking symbol of that day. My first instinct was to burn it, to purge its memory in a cleansing flame. But as I held the stiff fabric, a different idea, cold and sharp, took shape. This wasn't just a relic of my pain. It was evidence of his audacity. It was a trophy. I took the apron to my sewing box, the one I'd used to mend the kids' clothes and hem Ricardo's trousers. I selected a spool of stark, white thread. And then, carefully, meticulously, I stitched a single, capital letter onto the bib of the apron, right over the pocket that had once held my measuring spoons. I stitched a M. It wasn't an act of anger anymore. It was an act of curation. I was archiving the betrayal, turning his weapon into my artifact. I folded the apron, the white M prominent, and placed it in a small storage box in the basement, next to the divorce decree. Let it be a reminder, not of his betrayal, but of my resilience. Let future me, if I ever felt a flicker of doubt or nostalgia, Open that box and remember the woman who had been forged in the fire of that kitchen, and who had emerged not broken, but reforged into something harder, brighter, and entirely her own. The finality of the legal end brought a surprising quiet. The frantic energy of building my unassailable fortress of facts was gone. In its place was a vast, empty plain of possibility. I walked through the rooms of my house, each one stripped of the lingering ghost of us, and felt not emptiness, but space. Space to breathe, to think, to be whoever I decided to become. The hot coal of anger had cooled into a steady, reliable warmth, the engine of my new life, idling quietly, waiting for me to choose a direction and press the accelerator. The final decree was more than a piece of paper, it was a key. It unlocked a door I had kept bolted for decades, the one marked "What if?" With my financial life secured and the house truly mine, the silence was no longer an accusation, but an invitation. I decided to stop simply enduring my life and start living it again. My first foray back into the world was tentative. I reached out to old colleagues from my teaching days, my fingers clumsy on the keyboard as I typed messages to people whose faces I could barely remember. Their responses were warm, immediate, a chorus of "Laura, it's been so long." We met for coffee, and the initial awkwardness melted away into easy conversation about books and life. One of them, Sylvia, her hair now an elegant silver cap, leaned forward, her eyes sharp and kind. "The school needs teachers, Laura. The new ones are bright, but they lack the gravity you had. With your experience, they'll hire you instantly." And that's what happened. The interview felt less like an interrogation and more like a homecoming. I spoke of Shakespeare and Bronte not as dusty relics, but as old friends. At 51, standing at the threshold of a classroom again, I felt a nervous flutter I hadn't experienced in 20 years. But when I faced the sea of young, expectant faces, a familiar calm settled over me. I was introducing them to Wuthering Heights, and I saw it, that spark of understanding, the slight widening of the eyes when a student grasped the raw, destructive passion of Heathcliff and Cathy. It wasn't just about the books. It was about the connection, the shared discovery of a truth buried in centuries-old prose. I loved discussing themes, dissecting metaphors, and seeing literature ignite something in them. I was back in the world, not as Ricardo's wife, but as Miss Laura, the literature teacher. It was a title I wore with more pride than I ever had, Mrs. Of course, the past wasn't entirely finished with me. Ricardo tried to contact me a few times. His messages were like faint, persistent echoes from a sealed tomb. Apologies that had lost their meaning, pleas to be friends, to not throw away our history. I read them once, my heart a steady, unresponsive drum, and then I deleted them. There was no more room for him in the architecture of my life. I had demolished the wing he occupied and was building something new and entirely my own on the foundation. Beatrice celebrated with me, of course. She took me out to a loud, vibrant restaurant we would have never frequented before. "You're radiant," she said, clinking her wine glass against mine. "You look 10 years younger." She was right. I felt younger. The weight of constant compromise, of smoothing over his moods and managing his expectations, was gone. In its place was a lightness, a freedom that tasted like crisp autumn air. I felt free to be quiet, to be loud, to leave a dish in the sink if I felt like it, to spend a whole Saturday reading in my pajamas. The freedom was in the mundane, and it was exquisite. This new energy bled into my teaching. I started a book club after school, a voluntary thing that soon attracted a dedicated group of students hungry for more than the curriculum offered. We read contemporary authors alongside the classics, drawing lines from Jane Austen to today's feminist voices. One afternoon, a shy girl named Chloe stayed behind after the others had left. "Miss Laura," she began, twisting her hands. "That essay you had us write about a personal turning point, my mom read mine. She said it made her think. She's in a situation. Not a good one." My breath caught. I looked at Chloe, at the vulnerable hope in her eyes, and I saw a reflection of my own former self, the one who thought enduring was a virtue. What did you tell her? I asked gently. I told her what you said in class, she replied, her voice gaining strength. That a crisis can be a catalyst. That it's never too late to choose yourself. I had to sit down. The words, my words, had traveled beyond the classroom walls and were doing real work in the world. They were helping a stranger find the courage I had found. In that moment, my career wasn't just a job, it was a purpose. I was no longer just rebuilding my own life. I was, in some small way, helping to fortify others. That night, I walked through the rooms of my house. The ghost of us had been thoroughly exorcised. The space wasn't empty. It was full of potential. The hot coal of anger that had fueled my divorce had cooled into a steady, reliable warmth, the engine of my new life, idling quietly. I realized I was no longer waiting. I was no longer reacting. I was, for the first time since I was a young woman with a degree and a world of possibilities ahead of her, actively choosing my path. And as I stood there in the quiet, I knew the accelerator was under my foot, and I was finally ready to press down. The scent of cinnamon and baked apples wrapped around me like a warm, familiar shawl as I placed the pie on the kitchen counter. 1 year. 1 year since that Friday, and here I was, back in this kitchen, reclaiming every square inch of it. This wasn't the pie of betrayal anymore. It was my banner of victory. I had invited everyone. Beatrice, of course, who had been my rock. Sylvia, my colleague from school, whose friendship had become a cornerstone of this new life. A handful of other women who had drifted back into my orbit, their own curiosities piqued by my unexpected renaissance. And Lucas and Marina, my anchors, who looked at me now with a pride that made my heart swell. As I'd kneaded the butter into the flour earlier that afternoon, the motion was meditative. I remembered Grandma Helena's hands, gnarled with arthritis, but still impossibly strong, guiding my small, clumsy fingers. The secret is in the touch, Laura, she'd whispered, her voice a soft rustle. Too much, and the crust is tough. Too little, and it falls apart. It's a balance, like life. Mariana had stolen the instructions, a cup of this, a teaspoon of that, but she could never steal the touch, the legacy of strength passed from my grandmother's hands to mine. That was mine and always would be. The doorbell chimed, and the house began to fill with laughter and the clinking of wine glasses. It was a sound this house hadn't heard in years, not the strained, polite laughter of Ricardo's business associates, but the genuine, unrestrained joy of my chosen family. A toast, Beatrice said, raising her glass high, her eyes sparkling as they met mine. To new beginnings. To new beginnings, the chorus echoed around me. I raised my own glass, but my eyes fell on the perfect, golden pie. And to old recipes, I added, my voice clear and steady. The ones that remind us who we are. I cut a slice, the knife gliding through the flaky crust with a satisfying crunch. I brought the fork to my mouth and bit in. The flavors exploded, tart apple, sweet cinnamon, the buttery, crumbly pastry. It was perfect. Finally, after a year of phantom bitterness, it was perfect again. Looking around the room, I took a mental photograph. Lucas was animatedly telling a story to a captivated Sylvia, his hands flying. Marina was laughing with Bea, their heads close together. This wasn't a life built from the rubble of my old one. It was something entirely new, constructed on a foundation I had poured myself. The conversation ebbed and flowed around me, eventually landing on my teaching. Sylvia turned to the group. You should have seen Laura today. She had a line of students outside her office door. They call her the Oracle. Beatrice grinned. I love it. What's your secret, Oracle? Assign them extra homework. No, I said, a smile playing on my lips. I just listen. And sometimes I tell them it's okay to choose themselves. The words hung in the air, and my mind drifted back to Chloe, the shy girl from my third period class. Her essay had been about watching her mother slowly disappear into the shadow of her father's temper. I'd written in the margins, not just a grade, but a message. Asterisk, a crisis can be a catalyst. Your mother's story isn't over yet. Asterisk after class, Chloe had lingered, her hands twisting together just as mine used to. "Miss Laura," she'd begun, her voice barely a whisper. "My mom read my essay."
She cried. "Then she asked me about you."
She wanted to know how someone finds the courage to start over. The gravity of that moment settled on me again, right there in the middle of my party. My words, born from my own pain, had become a lifeline tossed to a stranger drowning in the same sea. My career wasn't just a job, it had become a purpose. I was no longer just rebuilding my own life. I was, in some small, profound way, helping to build others. Later, as the last guest hugged me goodbye and the taillights disappeared down the street, I was left in the quiet, contented hum of my home. I walked through the rooms, my fingers trailing over the back of the sofa, the spines of the books on the shelf. The ghost of us had been thoroughly exorcised. This space wasn't empty. It was full of my potential. The hot, burning coal of anger that had fueled my divorce had cooled into a steady, reliable warmth, the quiet, idling engine of my new life. I stopped at the large window in the living room, looking out at the moonlit garden. I realized, with a jolt of clarity, that I was no longer waiting. I wasn't waiting for a phone call, for an apology, for my life to resume its old shape. I was no longer just reacting to the world. I was, for the first time since I was a young woman with a literature degree and a world of possibilities at her feet, actively choosing my path. That first pie was no longer an anchor to the past, but a whetstone that had sharpened me for the chapters yet to come. The woman who had hidden behind wife and mother was gone, and in her place stood one forged of steel, ready for what lay ahead. I looked back at the kitchen, at the single remaining slice of pie sitting on the counter, like a promise. And as I stood there in the quiet, I knew the accelerator was under my foot. The road ahead was unwritten, mine to navigate. I took a deep, clean breath, and I was finally, unshakably, ready to press down.